My name is Jacek Bartosiak. Welcome to Strategy&Future.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another Strategy and Future podcast. We are now continuing our conversation with Greg Melcher. This one is going to be focused more on INF issues and nuclear deterrence, nuclear capabilities. Great to have you here, Greg, and the floor is yours.
Okay. All right. So let's talk a bit about nuclear threats and more specifically, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty that's at issue these days. I guess to go back in time a little bit, I think it's good to first think about what was the first offset strategy during the Cold War. We're now up to talking about the third offset strategy, but the first one was based on the fact that NATO faced a significant numerical disadvantage against the Warsaw Pact ground force divisions. So NATO came up with the idea of countering it with tactical nuclear weapons on the battlefield. Now today, things have kind of changed. It's no longer the Warsaw Pact, it's just Russia. And they have some disadvantages in their term. And if you really look at the full order of battle of NATO compared to Russia, they're an overall disadvantage to the total NATO force structure, especially as more and more countries, such as Poland and Romania, take the 2% expenditure target quite seriously. That said, Russia has never stopped its research and development into what I call partial fusion fraction non-strategic nuclear weapons. Some people call them tactical nuclear weapons. These weapons give them a relatively low yield and a clean weapon with low levels of fallout. In fact, it's somewhat shapeable in terms of, in terms of its yield as well as fallout. While many in the West would say Russia would never use these weapons because the West would respond with an overwhelming force of strategic nuclear weapons. And I've heard this point argued vigorously by people at Brookings and other well-thought-of institutions. I think they're flat dead wrong because the Russians, they appear to believe otherwise. They continue to train and practice with their nuclear forces fully integrated with their conventional forces. This can be seen by observing activities in their periodic Zapad exercises and a recent large-scale exercise called GROOM designed to test their nuclear triad. But GROOM also included the testing of the small nuclear warhead weapons, specifically the ones they have that violate the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. So let's get back to the U.S. To my knowledge, we have not kept pace with research in this type of nuclear weapon that can be employed in a wide range of tactical uses. I believe this absence of tension may have been justified at one point, as viewing Russia as a threat did not generally begin until their invasion into Georgian territory back in, I think that was 2008. The U.S. administration that followed this period was committed to what appears to be an unrealizable concept of global zero. In my opinion, it's a nice fantasy, but this thinking was conducted in parallel with the ongoing technological process of nuclear weapons development in Russia, willfully denying the reality that some counter to these weapons by the U.S. would be needed. This negligence created a gap. And frankly, I did some work in game theory looking at this problem, trying to figure out, well, what is a stable point and an unstable point between different levels of nuclear capability, including a global zero idea where no one has any. And frankly, all those game theories showed that global zero was a very unstable point. In fact, it was more stable to see countries have some degree of nuclear weapons than to try to get to this global zero. But nonetheless, it was a political cause without real strategic thinking behind it, in my opinion. So today, NATO and the U.S. have only the relatively dirty B-61 gravity weapons that must be dropped by tactical aircraft if they can reach the target against modernizing rare Russian air defense systems such as the S-400 or S-500. Now, fortunately, I believe the U.S. Nuclear Posture Review, just conducted in 2018, identifies this gap in capability and takes action to close it with both near and midterm options, but it's tough to make up for all this lost time. And it won't help anyone in the near term. All these answers will take a number of years to get to. So, but that topic alone is probably worth its own conference. So I think I'll move on and conclude with some thoughts and ideas about the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. So that's called and well known as the INF, but I like to say it out loud because Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. Keep remembering, people, that it's nuclear. That's what it's about. This addresses ground-launched missiles with a range of 500 to 5,500 kilometers, often called theater range missiles. I think it's important to say the full name, as I just said, as one abbreviates. It's easy to forget the word nuclear. In fact, we don't often forget that NATO's first offset strategy to counter the clear numerical support of Warsaw Pact conventional forces during the Cold War was to deploy tactical nuclear weapons in Europe. That's what we did. The INF Treaty came into force in 1987. This was a result of the Soviet Union deploying theater-range nuclear missiles, and NATO's response was to field ground-launched and ballistic theater-range nuclear missiles to counter them. The Soviet fear and response was that these NATO missiles could easily decapitate their leadership and led to what I believe many would say has been a very successful arms control treaty. However, the situation has changed substantially in the last 30 years. Over this time, China, which was never part of the INF Treaty, has grown immensely as a military power and now possesses a substantial arsenal of cruise and ballistic missiles that are theater range. Missiles of this range are required for China to reach their goal to dominate both the first and second island chains in the Western Pacific, which gives them their desired strategic depth. They will never agree to limit missiles of this type, and it creates a huge asymmetry with U.S. capabilities, which are for now limited to missiles that can be launched from Navy ships or aircraft. And of course, you have the problem of limited magazines with those sort of platforms. I can assure you that China has already calculated what it takes to exhaust those missile magazines. If the U.S. were to truly counter this situation, or at least become a near peer, it would require substantial deployment of ground-launched theater-range missiles stationed on the limited U.S.-owned territory in that region, or that of our Western Pacific allies. So at present, for the U.S., we have no theater-range ground-launched missiles. We have the ATACMS with a range of about 300 kilometers, and a new precision strike missile in development, which is not currently designed to exceed the INF range of 500 kilometers. From there exists a huge gap, as the next ground-launched missile in the U.S. inventory is the Minuteman intercontinental ballistic missile with a range of 13,000 kilometers, which is one key leg of our strategic nuclear deterrent, the ground-based part of the triad. Russia is in clear violation of the INF Treaty. They have developed, tested, and fielded several hundred ground-launched cruise missiles with a range of well over 5 kilometers, and there may be others. For those who have allowed themselves to be manipulated by Russian narratives to believe that somehow the U.S. is responsible for escalating an arms race in ground-launched theater-range missiles by dropping out of the INF Treaty, I'd like to offer the following analogy. If Russia, China, and the U.S. were running a 400-meter race, one lap around a track, this track representing both quality and quantity of their theater-range ground-launched cruise and ballistic missiles, China has already finished the race and is being handed the gold medal. Russia is on the backstretch with a half a lap to go. The U.S. has not even decided if it's going to run the race. I can't think of a simpler, more direct way to describe this situation. This is a great power competition that the U.S. is losing. Now, I acknowledge the U.S. has naval and air-launched cruise missile and ballistic missiles of this range, but as I said, that doesn't provide the parity, and it's not going to work in either theater. You really do have to have the ground-launched versions to provide the adequate deterrence against what the other countries have in their possession. But what should be done about this? Well, the obvious idea would be to reconstitute the treaty and get China to join it and destroy all ground-based missiles in that range. How likely is that? Could Russia be deterred from their current path? It is doubtful unless the U.S. and its allies had a countering capability in development or making plans to deploy them. That's exactly the situation that led to the INF Treaty back in the 80s. When we put the things out there and started to deploy them, that's when they said, oh, wait a minute now, let's start talking. And that led to the treaty in 87. Now, in the U.S., there are 3 near-term U.S. ground-based missile system options that are relatively affordable and could likely be fielded in the next 5 years. As mentioned earlier, there's the Precision Strike Missile. It's in development to replace ATACMS. Its design, it was limited by treaty to less than 500 kilometers, so it's not hard to take that system and, with some minor modifications, have it go a longer distance. Next, we have LRASM, an air-launch capability, fielded as an air-launched missile, cruise missile. It's been tested ground-launched, and such a variant can be developed and fielded without too much trouble either. Finally, the ship-launched Tomahawk Land Attack Missile, or TLAM, could be easily modified to be deployed in a ground launch variant. These three options implemented together, would provide a pretty robust short to mid-range theater missile deterrent to both Europe and the Far East. So imagine if these capabilities were then deployed on mobile launchers in, say, Poland and Romania. Would that result in an arms race? More likely, it would serve as a substantial deterrent from any additional Russian excursions. It would hold not just their forward-based forces at risk, but also their ability to reach back and hold at risk their strategic air and missile assets. So to avoid these deployments, would Russia pull back some of their forward-based offensive capabilities in Kaliningrad and Crimea and Syria? Would they? I don't know. Potentially. My net assessment today is that Russia can capture the land they want to establish strategic drift well before NATO can get there to prevent it. We talked about that earlier. Despite the many deterrence measures that have been implemented to them in the past 3 years, these are all the non-conventional things. And again, we just talked about that. A deployment of mobile ground-launched theater-range ballistic and cruise missiles in a few selected states in Eastern Europe would provide an extra deterrent to such action. And if the deterrent were to fail, this substantial firepower could be employed to both slow the Russian advance and provide the time needed for NATO reinforcements to arrive in the region. And frankly, ideally, probably you could do something like this much more quickly than you can fix the transportation problems that exist to go from west to east in Europe. So ideally, plans to implement programs of this nature on the part of the U.S. and NATO would bring Russia back to the negotiation table for a continuation of an INF-like agreement in Europe. However, it is a mistake not to point out that in terms of great power competition with China, the U.S. needs to develop this type of ground-launched cruise missile or theater or ballistic missile capability to balance capabilities in that region as well. Perhaps the solution is to develop the capabilities, field it as needed in the Far East, and use the existence of these weapons to get Russia to recommit to the INF treaty limitation for Europe, withdraw their missiles, and get them to avoid the U.S. allied deployments. So in the end, on this INF point, I think my conclusion is probably dead. But perhaps in killing it, we might be able to address a broader treaty, by actually going forward as before. Remember, the treaty in 87 only happened because we developed and fielded a capability, and then the Russians says, "Oh, you're serious. This threatens us. So let's see if we can do something different." So if we had the capability, they probably would back down again, and perhaps some agreement could occur in Europe. I'm not very optimistic it would happen in the Far East. Okay, so that's kind of my view of this, and happy to discuss issues of nuclear or INF that'll get your attention during the discussion.
Absolutely great. Thank you so much, Greg, for this. Because again, we at Strategy and Future, we also did did a far inferior analysis of the situation, but we did focus on it unless and looking at Zapad exercises you mentioned, and I think it was from 1999 they first tried using like TAC nukes, and it seemed to us the disproportion right now between the Russian capabilities of fielding theater-range nuclear weapons versus or opposite of both NATO and the US is so large that it really incites Russia. It destabilizes the whole situation because it is frankly inciting them to use their escalate to de-escalate in a way. But I was thinking, and we also thought about what conditions would have to be met for Poland to consider the situation stable. And as you said, the non-existence of nuclear weapons makes the situation more dangerous, right? Rather than their existence, as you pointed out in your criticism of the global zero policy. We also thought about declarative policy and extended nuclear deterrence, which used to be a workhorse for the US power projection, both in Asia and Europe. Would you say both NATO and the US declarative policies when it comes to deployment of nuclear weapons and the extended deterrence, what changes could there be to stabilize the situation?
Well, I mean, I think we're in a tough situation because all we have is large, very dirty weapons. No, they're not any. I mean, they're the same weapons. I mean, there has been nothing done in 30 years. I mean, so it's the same weapons that we had from the Cold War, they're a mess. They create a huge, fallout problem, and they're bigger than we would want to have if we needed to counter something or wanted to hold them at risk. So I think we've kind of boxed herself in a corner. Now, the nuclear posture review shows that somebody's been listening and paying attention and realized the problem that we have and that we have to dig our way out of the hole. But it's going to be a while. I mean, you can't turn on a dime on these things. It could take 5 or 10 years to really get in a position to have it there. Now you could also. That's why I said that the intermediate range ballistic or cruise missiles. I mean, they don't necessarily have to be nuclear. You can establish a lot of deterrence just by the ability to reach further with the quantity of those types of weapons. When I was talking about the fielding, I wasn't necessarily saying that they would necessarily have nuclear weapons on them, although probably they should be fielded in a way where that's kind of ambiguous. Well, we can or can't. That's on the situation. I think beyond the fact that you don't know, the ambiguous aspect of it makes it a stronger deterrent.
Sure.
And certainly the Russians are in that condition now. They're training with them. They have them there. We know they've got them. We know for example, they fortified all the bunkers in Kaliningrad so they could store them there, and we know they're there. Now, will they use them or not? I don't know. And that adds a deterrence value on theirs against the West. And what's our counter to all that? Again, I think it was willful ignorance because people were just in love with an idea that wasn't realistic. And they left us vulnerable, frankly. And so that means the only way to counter it was with a very large and dirty weapon, which will cause a lot of problems beyond, an escalation problem for something that ought to be able to be contained on a more tactical level.
I remember when I've read the NPR, the 2018 Nuclear Posture Review, it stipulated, and I think this process, according to the media, has been completed, of refitting Tridents with a singular lower yield missile. But I wonder if that's, again, because this all comes down to credibility of the deterrent. And do you think this is viable? Because, and this is again asking an expert, because when a launch of Trident is detected, it creates a huge threat that this will be miscalculated by the opponent, right? As being launched, it's not a tactical version of it, but rather
there's no way to
strategic.
Yeah, there's no way to know. How do you know what it is? So I don't think that's the answer. I mean, you can't
Exactly.
you can't use our strategic triad to deliver a tactical message. It has to be by other means. Otherwise, there's no way to know the difference, and it creates a huge risk of miscalculation. And the Russians,
Able Archer 83 kind of risk, right? In a way.
Yeah, but for the Russian point of view, their delivery systems are, they're being shot out of guns on the battlefield. They're not being shot out of a ballistic missile coming out of a submarine and flying 10,000 kilometers to a target, where somebody has to decide, what is that missile? Is it real? Is it a nuke? How big is it? Where's it going? So I don't think that's a viable solution. I think it's a dangerous solution.
Especially with launch on warning, right? I don't know if that's still in Russia. It used to be in Soviet times, but it's a huge risk, and that makes it less credible as a deterrent. Talking about two things, because it's easy to find on the, I don't know how accurate this data is, but it's fairly easy to find the yields. For example, B61, it's supposed to be the ILO yield, supposed to be 0.3 kilotons. I don't know. Again, this is what the publicly available information says. But what about Russians? Much harder to find any details about how tiny how small of a yield can Russians produce. Do you know anything about that?
Well,
that you can show?
No, I don't. I mean, everything I know is the same way you know it. Either I got it off the internet, or I talked to somebody who told me something, and how verifiable is it? What I do know is that they've continued their research into these weapons for a long time. I do know they train with them. I do know that we've observed them not actually setting them off in exercises, but certainly shooting them as part of an exercise. And how that modifies their behavior. And from that, you can take some conclusions in terms of their yield as well as their degree of fallout and the other things that could go from that. So, for example, it's not infeasible to imagine that they could believe that using them in an anti-missile mode might be enough that they can deter our triad. Now, that's a lot of missiles to shoot down, but that's possible. I mean, but I don't think anybody knows for sure. I mean, there might be somebody at a highly classified level that has a better idea from intelligence data or things like that. But I don't have any access to that. All I can look at is what's generally available, what we've observed in their behavior, how they train, how they operate, what you've seen in exercises, and from that you can take a pretty good conclusion that they have a more advanced weapon. You could take it by looking at what's going on with the technology, because whether you like it or not, this move to partial fusion fraction and trying to move to fusion is now a commercial solution. It's being done by industry who's pursuing fusion, and that is a proliferated capability, and that's moving on. I can just say that we haven't been in the business of trying to profit from that, at least not at our national labs, in terms of having a solution, unless this is some highly classified thing that I'm not privy to. And if it were, of course, I wouldn't be able to talk about it in a conversation like this.
Fair enough. Another interesting thing that really struck me is you said that the B61s are dirty. This is something again. So this partial fusion, this produces a cleaner aftermath.
Correct. B61 isn't dirty in the sense of any other weapon. Nuclear weapons create fallout, and they're very dirty in that sense. So if you shoot one, you see what happens, and it creates a mess for a long time. However, the technology, as you get closer and closer to fusion, allows you to reduce that fallout and shape that fallout in a lot of different ways. And so that's where I'm saying, in that sense, the weapons are much cleaner. They could be employed with, so you don't end up with a Chernobyl situation where, you can't go there for, the next 1,000 years kind of situation. You got where very localized, doesn't leave as much fallout problems on the ground, and it's probably easier to recover from them. But again, this is an area that has not been talked about much. There hasn't been a whole lot of research done on it. If you really dig into it, you can't find out too much just digging into all the research papers that have been done. Not a whole lot, because basically we said 30 years ago we're going to stop doing this kind of thing because we're in the era of everlasting peace, and it's now time to go to global zero. Unfortunately, that was in my view, a foolish assumption, and there should have been a plan B, but there wasn't. In fact, any attempt to even raise the question of plan B was completely shut down. Even within the Department of Defense, you couldn't even have that conversation.
And now the reckoning, right, is coming. So this is, as you said, a lot to make up, a lot of distance to make up. Another thing that we thought is promising in a way is extending nuclear sharing program within NATO to Poland, which is suboptimal because delivery again is F-16s in our case, which looking at Russian A2AD capabilities very suboptimal. But it would still form a deterrent, in our opinion. Would you concur with that? Do you think that's a viable thing to consider?
Well, I don't know. I mean, do you have pilots who are willing to fly an F-16 against an S-400 system? Do you think they'll get
against Russians?
Do you think they'll get,
if it's Russia, it's on the other.
Do you think they can get close enough? Do you think they'd be effective? I mean, you end up having
sure.
I mean, certainly having some capability is better than no capability, but a hard-edged assessment of that, which I think would have to be done at a classified level that we couldn't discuss here. But something like that ought to be done and really evaluated whether it's possible. But I feel, let's just say, I'm not optimistic that such a thing today, F-16 against a more modern, more state-of-the-art. I mean, the Russians certainly in a few areas have invested a lot of time and energy in staying at the state-of-the-art. One of them is their nuclear technology. Another is their anti-air or anti-missile capabilities. So things like their IAD systems are pretty good. I don't know. I mean, that might be a mission that you want to wait till you have an F-35 to fly. But, I think anytime you can have a variety of options that might be possible, and, in the hands of quality military officers who are very creative, they might be able to come up with an operational solution to make that system effective. So because of that, I think having it in hand and potentially able to be used or shaped in some other way to be used is a positive, particularly given the situation where we're clearly at a disadvantage. And doing something in the interim time before the results, at least from the U.S. NPR, can be put in place, I think is key. And even the idea of potentially putting those weapons on Polish soil or Romanian soil, for example, might not be a bad idea, or at least just the idea, just the threat that we might do it could cause some willingness on the part of Russia to modify their behavior and back down. So I think there's a deterrent possibility from that.
One thing that was, again, I think quite openly criticized in the NPR was the decision to retire nuclear tipped tomahawks, the TLAMs, and and again, this goes back to the positives that are associated with ground launched systems rather than air launched and sea launched. And since the US has abandoned, Russia has abandoned, the US has officially withdrew from the INF, is that they tested ground-launched tomahawks, which I think used to be known as Griffins. I'm sure you know better, but I think they used to be called Griffins and stationed in Europe back in the Cold War days. And this has really, I think this has caused it got a major reaction from the Russians. And of course, when we think about this, then one thinks of Regikov and Mark 41 VLS, right? Launchers that are either already located or to be located there. Do you think it's even, but I don't think there is much talk of bringing back this capability of TLAMs, nuclear capable.
Oh, no,
is that the case?
No, that's not true. One of the options from NPR is to develop and field a submarine-launched nuclear-tipped cruise missile. So it'd be an equivalent capability modernized to what the TLAM-N used to be. And, I worked in the Pentagon in the Navy leadership level during those years of the 90s and up to about 2005. And every year, that issue of killing that program, because the TLAM-N was a submarine-launched, torpedo tube-launched. I can't remember whether it was ever had a VLS variant or not. And the old version of Tomahawk, it's not the current version. Is called the Tactical Tomahawk. It has different capabilities, but that was never designed to be a nuclear weapon. The original Tomahawk missile, they were all designed to be nuclear, so it was actually a much more expensive missile to manufacture. And so the conventional versions of that is what we were using in the 90s and early 2000s when we went against terrorist targets and things like that. But there is a plan to both develop a new TLAM-N as well as a smaller nuclear viable yield type of weapon that's smaller than the B-61 and more sophisticated. I mean, this is something. This is public. I read it in the latest budget guidance or something. I don't remember. Some official document about what was funded for this coming year mentioned these capabilities, and they're in the plan to be developed. How long it will take, I don't know. But for many years, everybody wanted to kill it because, why do we have this weapon? Why do we need it? It's expensive. Why do we have to maintain it? The training, the storage, everything. But that's why it was done on the nuclear submarines, because they already had to deal with nuclear capability there, so had the right training. So all that got, at some point that it was actually on ground, as you mentioned. The system you mentioned was a different missile, by the way. It wasn't a Tomahawk, but But they took those out eventually, and then there was at one point they had air launch versions and things like that they had on ships. But eventually, then the whole deterrent of the smaller weapon like that was just the TLAM-N on the submarine launch for a while. And I don't remember the year at which it was actually killed, but it was probably sometime in the 2000s that they decided to stop building it. But again, we were at the time where we didn't have the enemies that we had today.
Sure. Another one that I thought was interesting, because whenever there is talk of U.S. nuclear assets, and this is my personal question, I'm really satisfying my own curiosity here, is the ALCM, the AGM-86B. It's because nobody ever mentions this missile. It's and it's also supposed to be dial yield, much larger yield, from what I know. but it's never mentioned at all. Do you know why is that? Why it's completely non-existent or barely mentioned?
Well, I think that was canceled as well, wasn't it? From what I understand.
Because this is the old one. I think it's still from AGM 86. So this one was also taken out of service.
Yeah. So that's like it's a B-61 type weapon. It's a smaller warhead. It's dialable. But anyway, I'm not that knowledgeable about it either. But I don't think they produce it anymore, and I don't think they field it. I don't recall hearing anything about that being currently fielded. And frankly, I think if it had still been capable and was still being used, I think there would have been more dialogue trading off between that and the tactical and the TLAM-N. And I don't remember that. I don't remember any of that dialogue, and I'm going back now to the late '90s, so 20 years ago. But anyway, so I don't know the answer to that. I'd have to do my own research to figure it
out. Greg, if you were to propose, starting with actual capabilities to declarative policy and say in 5 steps try to improve the situation, like bring back the flexible response capability to the US, what would be the most important? What would be the most important points to raise, things to do?
I don't know. It's a pretty complex question. I think I'd actually first go back to what I said in the earlier discussion. I think there has to be a net assessment of the situation in Europe of what are the complete set of Russian capabilities and their ability to employ them, where they are technologically, where their force structure is, where they stand on all their non-kinetic hybrid warfare capabilities. And then there has to be kind of a look at how not just NATO, but NATO, EU, partner nations, NATO, EU, and partner nations, how they can all work together, what they're capable of, what threats they face. And then you can start to do an analysis of how do you counter some of the capabilities. So there's things you can do from conventional forces, and then there's things where you have to worry about a nuclear capability. So is that a tactical weapon on the battlefield? Is it a ground-launched cruise or ballistic missile? Is it submarine-launched missiles? Is it air-launched missiles? How many do you need of each? What capability? Where do you store them? How do you operate them? Who knows how to use them? Which countries do you cooperate with? I think I was in Sweden, and in fact, they actually designed their whatever tactical aircraft they have. I don't know what it is. It actually was designed in order to be nuclear capable. So there's all kinds of things that were done a long time ago where people thought all this through. I don't think anybody's thought it all through. And maybe they have. Maybe there is now with the NPR, there's some cell of people in the Pentagon who have thought this through and actually have a plan to go forward. But that's what's missing, in my opinion. And there should be a public version of that, because the ability to offer the deterrence measures that come from public knowledge are important. So not just the public knows what it is, the Europeans know what it is, and the Russians know what it is. And then there probably needs to be also a more classified version. But I think in that you'd see some mix of a tactically employable weapon on the battlefield together with cruise missile type of capability, so both ballistic and cruise. Do you want to go back to the point where we had mines and all that kind of thing? I don't think so. Is it air? What's the trade-offs between a ground launched and an air launched? How do you counter the perceived and real capabilities that the Russians are talking about? Shooting it out of a tank-like vehicle. It's I think a 155 gun is kind of what they use for this, I think, or maybe it's 159. So there's a lot of variables there. So it's giving you a step of 5, I can't say. I spent a decade in the Pentagon working in the assessment division, and then a decade at APL doing the same thing. And this is the kind of thing that needs some hard-hitting analysis to really walk through all the different dialogue, all the different potential dynamics of what could happen, and then you can come back in a net assessment way and say, here's what we think we need to counter it. And then here are all the risks that could happen politically, technologically, militarily, operationally, and from that you can come up with a plan on what to do. So I'm not really, without having seen any work like that or have done any work like that, I don't really know what the right 5 steps would be. The only thing that gives me any hope, from the degree to which I've looked at it, is having read the NPR. It sure sounds to me like there are people who understand what my concerns are and are working to address them.
So I have one comment. It was interesting during or just before the NATO summit. President Macron proposed establishing European deterrence, which is ironic looking at his policy towards Russia and who else to deter. But it was interesting also when it comes to all the calculations of credibility of all actors. So it was even though Russia, I don't think France has anywhere near both warheads and capability, delivery methods to be credible in any way. But that's a separate thing. Two final questions, and they sort of go into more this popular science kind of affairs, which is because we really skipped China to a large extent. And there was a lot of talk, again, in the very amateurish circles about the possibility of harming U.S. aircraft carriers. And one of the opinions was that you would have to use a nuclear weapon to effectively sink one. Was this ever considered, or is this a factor, or is this just daydreaming or in professional talk?
I mean, they're talking about what China's planning to do.
That this is the only viable way of damaging aircraft carriers, destroying them effectively, or sinking them really more.
Well, they have some ballistic missiles. I'm a little dated now because I haven't really looked at it in, I guess really it's more like 4 years since I thought about it much. But they had a capability, I think it was called the DF-21 and the DF-26. The DF-21 was kind of designed to hit anything in the first island chain. The DF-26 was designed to go to the second island chain.
Go on.
And in the 21, if I remember correctly, and I mean, I have to go look and see, what the Janes or something like that says. At one point, it was going to be more of a unitary thing that would, be able to try and sink a carrier or something like that. But then, as I recall, they changed the design to be more one that was focused on, basically rendering the deck inoperable on a carrier, so it wouldn't sink it. So it was like, well, do we want to be that provocative? I mean, the point is we want to make the carrier ineffective. So if we just disable the runway with multiple smaller bomblets or something like that, I think that would be more effective from their perspective. And that's what I recall them doing. But I don't know. I mean, it seems to me like you'd have to hit it with a lot of ordnance to actually sink a carrier. But on the other hand, a big torpedo hitting any ship at the right place could sink a ship. Split it down the middle. And do our adversaries really want to be that provocative? If it's all out war, sure. But I don't think anybody wants to get in all out war. I don't think China, certainly, which is very economically driven, wants to get in all out war. We're doing that sort of thing. So I think for them, they would want to be able to just disable a carrier, and that alone would probably be enough of a message from their point of view to go to something as provocative, actually sinking a carrier, which would probably lead to a true war, economic disaster for them. And for a lot of people, people don't talk about it much, but the U.S. economy basically operates almost like a closed system for the most part. We're far less dependent on other countries or on trade with China, but China is completely dependent on their exports. So doing something like this would essentially shut their country down. So they'd be having to face a very difficult situation at home if suddenly that trade market was completely gone. That a war of that nature would happen. Anyway, so I don't see them going to that length. But whether what technically it takes to sink a carrier, I think it's more of a torpedo solution most likely.
I remember when I think there was one exercise with the USS America, right? Being this exercise of trying to sink a carrier, and I think it had to be scuttled at the end of the day. If I remember, like, reports about it.
Yeah, I think really, I think the vulnerability is just getting too close. They have a huge advantage in, as we talked about, missiles that would not pass would not qualify under the INF treaty. They have their order of battle is an order of magnitude larger of what we could carry against them and all of the ships that the Navy could put forward against China. And so I think that's really their strategy, is just to be able to overwhelm with conventional munitions enough to deter us from that approach, and again put the systems out of action, as opposed to sink everybody to the bottom in the classic sense of the naval warfare of the past.
And then there is also the question of satellites, right? And things like EMP and all that, attacking command and control and communications, right? Or guidance.
Well, they certainly have a robust capability, and continues to get better. And from what I hear, there's quite a bit of potential space warfare capability. I mean, that's why the U.S. created a space force just recently, realizing that both China and Russia have weaponized space, and that we just need to prepare for that world. But I kind of feel a little different about that. That's in the old world, where we put gigantic satellites up in space and they're very vulnerable. The new world is everybody's going to be putting thousands and thousands of small satellites in LEO to do all the same functions, and that is one that is very difficult to deter and do anything about. So I think that moment has sort of passed already, and in 5 or 10 years, the proliferation of small satellites all over will be so ubiquitous that no one can get an advantage any longer. No one can disable it all. And as we saw, the only people that have ever shot a satellite down is China, and they created quite a mess up there, which will be with us forever. And that's everybody who works in space knows that mess is there. And just imagine if there were another 100 satellites worth of messes created up there because of some sort of space warfare. But there's no question the conclusion from all this is that with AI technologies, big data analysis, and proliferation of small satellites everywhere, and their integration into all the other types of sensor systems, is that in the future it's going to be very difficult to hide anywhere by anybody. And most of that capability will be available from large corporations, not from classified military satellites. So I don't know. I think that's going to kind of equalize itself just from the economic aspects of it and the changes in technology over the next 10 to 20 years.
Great. Again, Greg, it has been a great pleasure. I'm very grateful for your time. I hope we'll have a chance to talk again at Strategy and Future. So thank you again for your time.
Great. I enjoyed it.